Sarah Miller looked like any ordinary young woman, until one morning she poisoned her entire family at breakfast and watched them die in silence. Sarah Miller had always been the quiet one in her family. Growing up in the suburbs of Maplewood, she was known for her intelligence and her calm, reserved nature. Her parents, Robert and Patricia, adored her and often said she would go far in life. For years that seemed true. She had been accepted into a good university, graduated with honors, and moved to the city to chase her career dreams. But life, as it often does, took a cruel turn. The job she was so proud of was gone within 2 years. Her relationship fell apart shortly after. When the bills piled up and the rent became impossible to pay, Sarah had no choice but to move back home. When she arrived, the Miller house hadn't changed. The white fence, the flower beds, and the smell of her mother's coffee in the morning all felt the same. But for Sarah, everything was different. The same walls that once held comfort now suffocated her. She felt like a guest in her own home, a reminder of her own failure. Her younger siblings, Emily and Jacob, were growing up fast, full of energy and plans. Her parents doted on them, talking about college, sports, and bright futures. Sarah watched it all from a distance, her expression neutral but her mind clouded with bitterness. Her parents tried to be kind. They told her she needed rest, that she would figure things out. But every word of sympathy stung like an insult. She couldn't stand the way her mother looked at her, part concern, part disappointment. Robert, her father, often talked about responsibility, about how life rewards those who work hard. Those words echoed in her head late at night, reminding her of everything she had lost. She spent her days in her old bedroom scrolling endlessly through her phone, watching others her age post pictures of weddings, new jobs, and vacations. Their smiles felt like knives. Every success she saw online deepened the pit inside her. She began to believe the world had moved on without her. She was stuck, invisible, and unwanted. The nights were the worst. The Miller house was silent after midnight, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. Sarah would lie awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. Sometimes she imagined packing her bags again, running away, starting over somewhere new. But then she'd think about the debt she owed, the credit cards she had maxed out, and the job applications that went unanswered. Each thought pulled her deeper into frustration and self-loathing. It wasn't long before she began blaming her family. She told herself they had always made her feel small, even when they didn't mean to. She resented how happy they seemed, how perfect everything looked from the outside. The more she thought about it, the more she believed that she had been left behind, that they had moved on from her. Her father's job, her mother's charity work, her siblings' achievements, it all felt like a mockery of her own failure. One afternoon, she stood by her bedroom window, watching her father mow the lawn and her mother wave to a neighbor. The scene was so ordinary, so calm, that it made her furious. She clenched her fists until her nails dug into her palms. Something inside her snapped, not in a burst of rage, but in a quiet, chilling realization. If she couldn't escape this life, maybe she could end the things that made her feel trapped in it. The thought came and went like a whisper, but once it entered her mind, it never left. That night she sat at her desk with the light off, staring into the darkness. The plan wasn't clear yet, but the feeling was. She wanted to be free, free from the disappointment, the comparison, the pity. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She simply sat there, breathing slowly, as a strange calmness filled her chest. For the first time in months, she felt something close to control. It was a dangerous peace, the kind that comes before a storm. And it would soon grow into something no one in the Miller family could have ever imagined. In the days that followed, Sarah's mood shifted in subtle ways that no one noticed. She began waking earlier than usual, sitting quietly at the kitchen table long before anyone else was awake. Her mother thought she was finally finding motivation again, but Sarah's calm demeanor was not the result of healing. It was calculation. She had started to observe everything around her with meticulous attention, almost like she was studying a pattern. She watched the way her father took his pills every morning, the exact time her mother brewed her tea, and which cupboard held what food. Every small detail mattered. She started volunteering to do the grocery shopping, claiming she wanted to help around the house. Patricia was relieved. She thought her daughter was trying to be part of the family again. But Sarah's interest wasn't kindness. She was quietly testing how much freedom she had, how much she could do without anyone questioning her motives. She noticed that no one ever checked the receipts, and no one paid attention to what she brought home. Each trip to the store became an opportunity. She learned which pharmacies asked questions and which didn't, and how to pay in cash without leaving a digital trace. Her resentment grew stronger with every passing day. The more she watched her family laugh and move on with their lives, the more isolated she felt. Her father often praised Emily for her good grades, or Jacob for his achievements in sports, while Sarah sat silently at the table, staring at her plate. No one meant to make her feel forgotten, but that's exactly how she felt. The envy twisted into anger, and anger soon turned into something darker, cold and deliberate. One afternoon, while cleaning the kitchen, she found her mother's old medication bottles in a drawer. She turned them over in her hands, reading the labels carefully. A thought sparked in her mind, something precise and horrifying. Later that night, she sat on her bed scrolling through her phone, researching chemicals and dosages, reading articles about substances that could be disguised in food or drink. The information came easily. The internet had answers for everything if one knew how to look. Her plan took shape slowly. She didn't rush it. Each step was quiet and invisible. She began by collecting small quantities of harmless-looking substances. She mixed and tested them on small portions of food, discarding the results after she was sure of her precision. To anyone else, it would have looked like she was simply cooking more often. Her mother praised her for the effort, unaware that every meal was a rehearsal. At night, she started keeping a notebook, a plain spiral pad she hid behind her dresser. Inside were lists and notes, calculations of amounts, and sketches of meal plans. She wrote down which food items absorbed liquid easily, which flavors masked bitterness, and which stores sold what she needed. The pages looked like something from a science student's project, but the purpose behind them was far from academic. Sarah wasn't driven by a sudden fit of rage. She was patient, methodical, and disturbingly calm. She convinced herself that what she was planning was logical, even justified. Her family, she thought, had never truly understood her. They saw her as weak, as someone who had failed to keep up. They didn't deserve to move forward while she lived in their shadow. Then everything shifted when she stumbled upon her father's insurance documents one evening. She had been helping him organize old papers in his office when a thick folder caught her attention. Inside was a life insurance policy that listed her as one of the primary beneficiaries. The number printed in bold stopped her cold. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. She closed the folder slowly, her heartbeat steady but her thoughts racing. The bitterness that had consumed her now had direction. What began as a cruel desire for revenge was about to evolve into something calculated and greedy. After that discovery, Sarah's pace quickened. She made fewer mistakes in her notes, moved with more confidence, and even started humming to herself while preparing dinner. Her mother thought she was finally happy again. Her father praised her for taking responsibility around the house. Her siblings laughed with her like old times. But beneath the surface of those warm family moments, Sarah was counting down days. She wasn't thinking about guilt or the pain she would cause. All she saw ahead was a clean slate, freedom from failure, and a future funded by the very people who had unknowingly stood in her way. The morning of the tragedy was bright and calm, the kind of day that made their street look like a postcard. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, birds chirped outside, and the air smelled faintly of spring. Inside the Miller house, everything appeared ordinary. Patricia was setting the table for breakfast, humming softly to herself. Robert was reading the newspaper in his usual seat by the window. Emily and Jacob were arguing playfully about who got the last pancake. Sarah moved around the kitchen quietly, her face calm and focused. To anyone watching, she looked like the picture of normalcy, but her mind was cold and distant. She had already made her decision. The night before, she had spent hours preparing. Every ingredient was measured, every motion rehearsed. She had mixed the chemicals into the maple syrup, ensuring the texture and smell remained unchanged. It was the final step in a plan that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. She hadn't slept at all, though she didn't feel tired. Her hands didn't shake. She felt detached, as if she were watching someone else carry out her instructions. There was no hesitation left in her, only purpose. As her family gathered around the table, Sarah poured syrup over the stack of pancakes, her movements steady. She smiled faintly when her mother thanked her for cooking. Her father asked her about her job search, and she replied with short, vague answers. She didn't care what he said anymore. Her eyes wandered over their faces, memorizing every detail, their gestures, their smiles, their laughter. Within minutes, all of it would be gone. The first signs were subtle. Her father reached for his glass of water, pausing as a wave of dizziness washed over him. Patricia rubbed her forehead, blaming it on fatigue. Emily stopped eating halfway through her meal, saying she felt strange. Jacob pushed his plate away, his appetite suddenly gone. Sarah watched silently, her fork untouched. Her pulse quickened as she saw it begin to take effect. Her mother stood to clear the plates, but her knees buckled beneath her. The glass fell and shattered on the floor, spilling water across the tiles. Panic filled the room. Robert tried to call for help, but his words came out slurred. Emily was crying now, confused and frightened. Within moments, their strength faded completely. The once lively house turned into a scene of chaos and silence. Sarah didn't move. She watched as her father collapsed beside his chair, her mother gasping weakly before falling still. Emily's cries grew softer until they stopped. Jacob slumped forward, his hand still clutching his fork. The sound of the clock ticking in the background was the only thing that remained alive in that room. When it was over, Sarah stood up and looked around. The scene was surreal, yet it didn't feel shocking. She thought she would be shaking, maybe crying, but there was only an eerie calm. The smell of pancakes and syrup hung in the air, mixing with something metallic and wrong. She walked upstairs to her room, changed into clean clothes, and sat on her bed for a long time. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing evened out. She told herself it was done, that soon she would be free. An hour later, she left the house. She drove with the windows down, letting the wind hit her face as if it could wash away what she had done. She didn't have a destination in mind. She stopped at a gas station miles away, bought a coffee, and sat in her car staring at nothing. She imagined the news headlines, the shock of the neighbors, the sympathy she would receive. She believed she had planned it perfectly, that no one would suspect her. After all, she had been home when it happened, or so she would claim. She had rehearsed every word of her story. By the time she returned home that evening, the sun had begun to set. The street was quiet, the Miller house still and dark. She parked her car, took a deep breath, and walked toward the front door. The air felt heavy and the silence pressed against her ears. She told herself this was what she wanted, an ending that would give her a new beginning. But as she stepped inside and looked at the motionless shapes that had once been her family, something inside her shifted. It wasn't guilt exactly, but an emptiness so deep it almost felt physical. The peace she had imagined wasn't there. Instead, there was only silence and the faint smell of syrup that would forever cling to her memory. The following morning, the quiet street came alive with sirens. A neighbor had noticed that the Miller house, usually filled with the sound of laughter and movement, had been eerily silent all day. When Patricia hadn't answered her phone or opened the door, the neighbor finally called the police. By the time officers arrived, the sun was high and the house looked calm from the outside, too calm. But once they stepped inside, the smell of spoiled food and something faintly chemical filled the air. What they found in the dining room was unlike anything their small town had ever seen. The bodies of Robert, Patricia, Emily, and Jacob were discovered seated or collapsed near the kitchen table, as if frozen in the middle of breakfast. The table was still set, plates half full, syrup bottles open. There were no signs of a break-in, no overturned furniture, no struggle. Everything was disturbingly neat. The only thing that seemed out of place was the absence of emotion. The scene was so quiet, so still, that one of the officers whispered that it felt like walking into a photograph. Sarah returned home just as the investigation began. She played her part perfectly. She gasped, stumbled, and clutched her chest when the officers told her what had happened. She said she had gone out early that morning to clear her mind and came back to find the police there. Her voice was shaky, her eyes red with what seemed like grief. Everyone believed her at first. The officers even comforted her, calling her poor girl, the only survivor of a terrible tragedy. But as the investigation deepened, the story began to unravel. The medical examiner noticed inconsistencies in the victim's symptoms. The cause of death was initially listed as poisoning, but the substance used was rare and precise. It wasn't something one could accidentally ingest. Toxicology reports confirmed it, a manufactured compound, one that required deliberate mixing and knowledge of its effects. The authorities started questioning how it ended up in the Miller's breakfast. Detectives searched the house thoroughly. They combed through the kitchen, collecting every container, every piece of food, every bottle. Nothing made sense at first. Then one of the investigators found something odd in Sarah's room. A small notebook tucked behind her dresser. The first pages looked harmless, filled with grocery lists and random thoughts. But as they flipped through, the writing became darker. There were notes on dosages, sketches of meal layouts, and short calculations. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of planning. The discovery changed everything. Sarah was brought in for questioning again. But this time the detectives approached her differently. They noticed how calm she seemed, how her eyes stayed steady even when they spoke of her family's deaths. Her answers were short, calculated, almost rehearsed. She said she loved her family, that she couldn't imagine hurting them. But when asked about the notebook, her explanation faltered. She claimed it was research for a story idea, but the details matched the crime too closely to ignore. Investigators dug deeper. They found security footage showing her car leaving the house much earlier than she had claimed. Purchases made in cash from multiple pharmacies matched the chemicals found in the victim's systems. Every piece of evidence tied back to her. Then came the most damning discovery, the life insurance documents. Robert's policy named Sarah as a beneficiary, set to receive a significant payout upon his death. When combined with her debts, it painted a clear and chilling motive. The public couldn't believe it. News outlets swarmed the story, labeling her the Maplewood daughter. Her calmness made her appear almost inhuman on camera. Reporters described her as emotionless, her expression unreadable as she was led from the house in handcuffs. Neighbors who had known her since childhood stood outside, whispering in disbelief. Some refused to believe she was capable of such horror. Others said they had always sensed something off about her. In the interrogation room, Sarah barely spoke. When confronted with the evidence, she didn't cry or protest. She simply stared at the table in front of her, her hands folded neatly. One detective later said it was as if she had already accepted what was coming. But the truth was darker. Sarah didn't feel guilt. She felt something close to satisfaction. The plan she had spent months perfecting had almost worked. She had come close to walking away untouched. What she didn't plan for was the one thing she couldn't control: how thoroughly the police would look for answers in a town that had never seen a crime like hers. By the end of the week, Sarah Miller was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. The story that began as a tragedy had turned into a nightmare, one that left an entire community questioning how evil could hide so quietly behind an ordinary face. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the day Sarah Miller's trial began. The case had drawn national attention by then. transforming the quiet suburb of Maplewood into a symbol of unimaginable betrayal. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions, and curious locals gathered just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had killed her entire family. Sarah entered the courtroom in a plain gray suit, her hair tied neatly back, her face expressionless. The media called her the Calm Killer, a name that seemed to fit her unsettling composure. She didn't look at the audience or the cameras. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor as if she were somewhere far away. The prosecution painted a picture of greed, resentment, and cold calculation. They described how Sarah, once the pride of her family, had returned home burdened by failure and debt. They told the jury about her carefully planned scheme, the notebook full of details, the chemicals purchased under false pretenses, and the life insurance policy that promised her freedom. Every piece of evidence was laid out methodically, each fact revealing the layers of her deception. The jury listened in silence, occasionally glancing at Sarah, searching for a trace of emotion. There was none. Her defense team tried to present her as a victim of mental collapse, claiming years of emotional neglect had pushed her into a state of psychosis. They spoke of pressure, expectations, and untreated depression. But the facts were too precise, the planning too deliberate. Psychologists who examined her said she displayed no signs of breakdown or confusion. Instead, they described her as fully aware, rational, and disturbingly detached. When asked why she did it, Sarah's only response was that she wanted to be free. Those 5 words echoed through the courtroom, chilling everyone who heard them. Throughout the trial, Sarah never cried. She never defended herself with passion or regret. When the prosecution displayed photos of her family, the breakfast table, the overturned glass, her siblings' school portraits, she didn't flinch. The jurors found her silence more haunting than any confession. She looked like someone who had already accepted her fate, not with remorse but with the same eerie calm that had defined her actions from the start. The verdict came after only 3 hours of deliberation. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read the sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Sarah stood still, her eyes fixed on the space in front of her. There was no reaction, no sigh, no tear. The courtroom erupted with whispers, but Sarah seemed disconnected from the noise. As guards led her away, she briefly turned her head toward the window where sunlight streamed through the glass. For a moment she closed her eyes as if feeling it one last time before disappearing into the life she'd created for herself. A life behind bars. In prison, Sarah became a mystery that no one could fully understand. Other inmates kept their distance. Her quietness unnerved them. She spent hours in the library, reading psychology books and writing letters to no one. The guards said she was polite, obedient, and emotionless. She never spoke about her family, and when questioned by psychologists, her answers were brief and chillingly rational. She said she didn't hate them, but that she needed peace. The meaning of that peace was something no one could comprehend. Over time, her story faded from national headlines, replaced by newer scandals and crimes. But in Maplewood, the memory of the Miller family never left. The house was eventually sold, renovated, and later torn down. Yet those who lived nearby still avoided walking past the empty lot at night. Some swore they could still smell the faint sweetness of syrup on warm mornings, drifting through the air like a ghost of what once was. Years later, a journalist visited Sarah for an interview. She was older now, her face thinner, her hair streaked with gray. When asked if she regretted what she did, she looked up with the same calm expression she had worn the day of her arrest. "Regret doesn't change anything," she said softly. "They were gone the moment I decided I was done being forgotten." The word sent a chill through the reporter. Sarah. Miller's name became a quiet warning, whispered in true crime circles, a reminder that evil doesn't always come with rage or madness. Sometimes it hides behind silence, behind the face of someone who simply stops caring. Her motive, simple yet horrifying, remained unchanged to the end. She killed her whole family just for one reason: to feel like she mattered even if it meant destroying everything that ever loved her.